This lesson covers part 2 of managing tables. Topics include: how do you add new columns or alter the structure of a table? How can you review, add, and remove data from a table? And what if you need to rename the table? Moving back to our PHP MyAdmin screen, we'll once again select the database class. As was shown in part 1, we created a table called users with 2 columns. In order to review the structure of the table, we select structure. You'll notice we have an option to modify the current columns by selecting change. We can remove a column by selecting drop. We can also check mark the columns and perform the operation simultaneously. In addition, there's a facility for adding columns. We can add a column after a specific field. So for example, after user ID, we could insert a new column, or we could insert columns at the end of the table or at the beginning of a table. Assuming now that we're going to be adding 5 columns at the end of the table, we click on the button. We then see a screen, which is very similar to the screen that we saw earlier in part 1, where we can identify the names of the columns, the data type, the length, defaults, collation, and so forth. It should be noted that there are 3 additional columns at the end of the screen. These are used for purposes strictly within PHP MyAdmin. So for example, you can indicate the MIME type, a browser transformation. So for example, text, plain, link, and then you can put in some information. So for example, you might have a website which will be prepended to the data from the column and presented as a possibility strictly within PHP MyAdmin. For the purposes of this course, we are not going to utilize the last 3 columns. So presuming that we're going to fill out the data, let's go ahead and continue. Presuming that we have now altered the structure of the data and we've performed an import, let's have a look at how you can go about reviewing the data and making modifications. First of all, we would select the table. The default operation, if you have data in the table, is referred to as browse. You can also review the structure by clicking on structure. As we indicated before, you can change or drop the various fields. You can check mark and perform operations on the various fields. You can add new information and identify different sorts of indexes. Indexes are discussed in another lesson. Moving now to browse, as you can see, we have a listing of information that's currently in the table. By clicking on any of the icons at the top, we can alter the order of the data as it appears on the screen. Currently, we're viewing the balance in ascending order. By clicking on the red arrow, we can reverse the sort order. We can then view the information and make changes as needed. To change a single item, you'd locate the row and click on Edit. This brings up a screen which allows you to make changes on the various pieces of information within the row. Likewise, you can also remove rows of data by simply checkmarking them and then performing an operation on all of the rows which are checkmarked. So you notice we can change all of these rows. We can delete all of these rows, or we could perform an export. Export allows us to write the information out to an external file. The file can be a CSV file, for example, or it could be an SQL file, which could be used to later re-import the data onto another server. To add information to the table involves either performing an import operation, or you could select Insert. Insert brings up a screen, and it allows us to fill in information, which will then later go into the database. So for example, we can add a record for Abraham Lincoln. As you will recall, because the last 2 fields are marked null, in other words, we are allowing a null value, we don't necessarily have to enter information into these fields. We can then continue to add information Alternatively, we could insert as a new row. We could insert a row and ignore errors, show the query, return to the previous page, insert another row. We can also continue inserting by specifying the number of rows that we would like to add to the table. We will go ahead then and click on Go, adding the particular information. Remember, the auto increment will allow us to generate the user ID automatically. We don't have to add that information. Here's the database query that was performed to insert the data. We go back to Browse. We sort by user ID. Click on the down arrow to reverse the order of the sort. And you'll notice that we now have 81, which represents the new row which was added to the table. In review, how do you add new columns later? Select the database, select the table, then structure. You then have the option of at the end of the table, at the beginning of the table, or after a specific column. What if you need to alter the structure? Select Structure, and then in the row for that column, you can select Change to make changes to the information about the column, or Drop if you want to remove the column entirely. How can you review data in the table? You would select Browse. How can you add data to the table? You could select Import, or alternatively, click on Insert and type in the information directly. How can you edit or remove data from a table? Checkmark the row, select Edit, or select Delete when using Browse. If you're using SQL, you can also use the SQL update or delete commands. What if you need to rename the table? Select the table and then choose the Operations tab. You will then have the option to rename the table, move it, or copy it, among other options. This concludes our discussion of managing tables.